Hi, welcome back. So you saw that video, and clearly you saw somebody who was acting in a rather unethical fashion, and there were even some other issues involved with that, of course. Now, one of the things that makes us think about when we see that is just the extent to which we can have trust in testimonials in general, but also in terms of just what happens on the internet or in social media, the case may be. So when you think of what Sampan was doing, in some respects, she's just trying to make a buck, right? And it didn't matter to her that she was endorsing products about which she knew nothing. And it makes us think about this, right, in terms of how we get this sort of information, especially through the internet or other types of social media platforms. And it also makes us think about how we deal with trust in a kind of digital world, right? So when you think of all the platforms that we may be part of, and some of the other some of the types of businesses that operate digitally that really try to engender trust, right? When you think of what Airbnb is about, in some respects, it is a kind of a trust business, right? We have to, how do we trust that the place we're going to rent is a good place, etc.? And how do we trust that the people that would come into my home to rent it are in fact going to be decent people and the rest and honor their obligations and whatever. So in that sense, you can think of a whole host of things that exist. For example, Yelp, Uber, Airbnb, as I said, TripAdvisor, right? And with these things, you have all these sort of endorsements or testimonials that people provide, saying yes, on, for example, on Yelp, yes, this restaurant was great. I went there. It did wonderful things. Food was great. Price was great, etc., etc. And we kind of lapse into believing these sorts of endorsements, right? Because they do seem to be from like actual people and the rest. And it, in the case of Sanpan, it gives second thought to that, right? That we somehow are trusting of something where in fact we don't really know if those endorsements or those testimonials are in fact genuine. In many cases they are, but we don't know when they're not. So in that respect, I would also ask you to think about ways in which you engage digitally with whether it's trying to get an Uber or something like that, whatever context you can think of. Think of ways in which trust, establishing trust, becomes important in terms of whether you'll use the service or not, and then to what extent do you come to believe the testimonials that you would see, or the endorsements, or whatever the case may be, or a rating system or something like that? To what extent do you hold faith in the credibility and the accuracy of those testimonials as well? All right. Oh, and just before we go to the next slide, I forgot to mention that the program that Amy Johnson went to, that the Institute, it cost $11,000 for 2 weeks, right? It's not cheap to learn how to do juicing and coffee enemas, I guess. So something to think about. Okay, so this slide here is just a kind of overview slide of what's going to come in the next half hour or so as I'm talking. In some ways, I put this up there to also help you when you're organizing your lecture notes. For example, like I don't do this with every lecture in terms of putting all the key points in a summary slide like that, but that's something you would want to do in advance for the test, is just to make sure that you're aware of the key terms, the key concepts and themes that are discussed in a particular lecture. All right. So these are the things we'll be talking about as we go through the rest of this lecture. Now, I had mentioned before that Lydia Pinkham had lots of people writing her. And these were women who saw her ads, and the ads often encouraged women to write to Lydia Pinkham to talk about the issues they were encountering, right? We talked about those issues as being things like menstruation, painful menstruation, or other types of problems around menopause. And these were often topics that women did not feel comfortable talking about with others. There was a sense of secrecy and, to some degree, even a sense of stigma attached to topics like that. And so what that does is it creates an opportunity for a company, right? If people are shy about talking about something, or if they're afraid that they will be cast in the wrong way by speaking about it in a polite society, whatever, if you can open up that opportunity to them to have that kind of discussion with a company that's also selling products to treat those things, it can be a wonderful marketing opportunity to engage as such, right? So in that sense, as we talk about Lydia Pinkham, and this is from the standpoint of the mail order side of the business, I mean, you could buy Lydia Pinkham, the vegetable compound, in a store, in a drugstore. You could go in, pay cash, and buy the product and go home. But you could also buy it through the mail. You could also send in your money order to the company, and they would send you the product back through the mail. So what this brings about isn't just people putting mail orders to the company. People were often writing letters to the Lydia Pinkham company. And they were doing that because the company in its advertising would say things like, correspond with us, write to us, your correspondence is confidential, we are women here, will only be women that will read your letters, no men. So in that sense, there's a measure of trust that they're trying to engender with their clients. And some have argued that in this sense, the Lydia Pinkham company was actually a kind of commercialized medical advice network that existed. And we'll talk about the aspects of that in a second. Okay, so this is an interior shot, a photo of Lydia Pinkham, one of their offices, their main office, in fact, in the early 1900s. Now you can see here it's a picture of clerical work that's being done. A number of women are sitting at desks and they're writing letters, they're writing correspondence, and they're dealing with orders that are coming in and the rest. Now note what's at the back of there. You see the volumes, the bound volumes that are on that back wall. Those are the actual letters that were sent by customers. When the letters came in, and maybe they resulted in a particular order for the vegetable compound, the letters weren't thrown out afterwards. They were kept. And they were kept in ways that meant that they understood the potential value of that information. So Lydia Pinkham, by the 1890s, had about 30 female clerks working in their main office like this. And they would have been engaged in things like filing orders, answering letters, mailing booklets out to people. They would then sometimes index the responses, right? So if somebody was writing back and they were saying, I have painful menstrual cramps, etc., but they also might said, and I also, have been diagnosed with diabetes, or I have some other type of illness. Well, they would index that information. So they had a record of a particular person linked to particular types of ailments. So over time, after about 20 or so years of the company's existence, these operations become the kind of bedrock of Pinkham's operations. The clerical kind of maintenance, the management of this information that's coming in from women writing to them becomes very, very important. In fact, at this time, there are more women working for the company doing this type of work than there were men who were in the production facility actually manufacturing the vegetable compound. So this was, in many respects, a kind of female workplace. I mean, you had all these clerks and typists and stenographers and then people doing correspondence. And sometimes Pinkham, when some of the critics of the patent medicine industry would attack companies like Pinkham, they would even raise that issue. They would say, well, it's just a place full of women working there, and what do they know? They're not, true medical professionals like the men who are doctors, etc., etc. So when you look at Pinkham, say by 1900, and you look at this like a photo like this, in some respects, firms like Pinkham, patent medicine firms like Pinkham, had kind of more in common, say, with an insurance company like Metropolitan Life or something, in terms of the emphasis on managing information and accurate record keeping and that sort of thing. Now, I want to just read you a quote here, and it has to do with the human chemistry quote that I have at the quotations I have at the top. So, one of the commentators or critics of Pinkham made this point. He said, "It was not the chemistry of the compound that mattered, but the human chemistry between Lydia and the women who trusted her." Human chemistry. Okay? And that had to do with the fact that so many women were writing to Lydia Pinkham and forming a kind of bond in that sense. So these advice letters started coming very soon after the company formed, and advertising and encouraging people to write them that way. And the estimate is that by 1929, the company had about 400,000 of these letters on file. Now, these were a variety of things. Some of these letters were testimonials of sort. People were writing in saying, "I used your product. It was great. It helped me so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you." Others were letters that were coming in just asking questions about their conditions, because again, they may not have felt like they could talk about it with other people because there was a sense of stigma attached to it. And you also had a kind of triangulated correspondence, right? You had customers writing to Lydia Pinkham, and then those women at Lydia Pinkham, the clerks, writing back to those customers, answering their questions. In some cases, maybe also filling an order for the product as well. So you had that kind of correspondence. You also had the correspondence I mentioned before, where somebody reading an ad with a testimonial in it from, say, Mrs. Brodka, like the example I had before. They might write to her, and then Mrs. Brodka might forward that correspondence to Lydia Pinkham, etc. So it was a kind of triangulated form of correspondence. And the net effect of that was to generate trust. It really was. Like, people trusted Pinkham because of the fact that she was writing back. Now, she wasn't personally writing back. Of course, the staff were writing back. But they trusted her in that sense because they saw that she was providing information that they deemed to be helpful in their lives. So generating trust in that sense, certainly good customer relations. You know, it's when you're in this business, right? And if you keeping track of the customers you have, and you do that through the written correspondence, and it may be that 5 months ago you filled an order for Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound, and then you're checking through your files and noticing that they haven't actually requested another order. So you might follow up with a letter to them saying, "Hey, just note, how you doing, etc. And then how are things? And, we'd be happy to fill an order for you if you would like." That sort of thing, right? Customer relations, building it through written correspondence, and just general goodwill that you create for the company itself. So that's an example of the human chemistry that would have existed in Pinkham. Now, here's another example of writing for advice. And I'm just going to talk about this example because it primarily targeted men. And this was the category called men's specialist remedies. And these were products that were primarily targeted to men who were experiencing either impotence or sexually transmitted disease of some sort, right? Now, both of these things carried a serious social stigma, right? If you were a man, you would not want to talk about impotence, and you certainly wouldn't want to talk about thinking that you have a sexually transmitted disease, right? So whenever there's secrecy and stigma, there's an opportunity for a business to capitalize on. So in this case, what they would do is these companies would have, they'd have these ads, and here there's a couple examples here, and they basically would, they would be for men's weaknesses. That it was always euphemism. They would never say, sexually transmitted disease or impotence or something. It was always sort of framed in these sort of euphemisms, these sort of alternative wordings that men would have probably known what the real meaning was, right? So male weakness would have been a form of, would have been seen as impotence. And they would have these ads. And they basically said, look, if you think you're troubled by this condition or something like that, just write to us and we'll send you a free pamphlet or a brochure or something, just giving you some advice on how to deal with your particular affliction. That's it. No, it's going to be free. There's no strings attached. We're not selling you a product or anything like that. We just want you, to know that there's this information that we can provide for you. And so people would do that. They would, and of course the promise was that the pamphlet they would send would come in a plain brown envelope, so nobody would know where it was coming from and that sort of thing. So, but once you wrote to this company and gave your name and your address, you actually no longer become anonymous, right? And so by doing that, you actually give over some power to that business without you even realizing that. And this was how it would kind of work. So let's say you're John Smith, you've written away for this free pamphlet on impotence, and it comes back to you in the mail, and the pamphlet may not really help you that much, but you figure, what did I lose? Nothing really. Except what might happen later, a week or two later, you get this follow-up letter from the same company. And what they essentially say, and this is actually what many of these companies did, was, in this case, let's say it's the Interstate company, and they send a letter, and they basically say, our remedy is waiting for you at the local post office. We've shipped you a shipment for, say, $10 worth of this. It just, what's required for you is to go there. It's cash on delivery. Pick up this this medicine for you that we've provided. Now the guy receives the letter and goes, well, I didn't order that, and so he might just initially ignore it. But then a follow-up letter comes a week later, or 2 weeks later, and it basically says, I noticed you haven't picked up the shipment we sent. Just to let you know that there's another person in your town, let's say your small town, who has written to us with the same problem, and we're prepared to let that person get your shipment, and we'll tell him that you didn't want it, and that it's available for him. Now, of course, what that does to the original man is he sees this and goes, oh my God, like this other guy in town is going to find out that I have impotence, right? And what the effect of that is that in some cases, some of them would have actually ended up buying the shipment or picking up the shipment, paying for it, just to avoid somebody else learning about their situation. And you might think, well, okay, if the guy ends up spending $5, $10, whatever, and then it's over. Well, it's not, because these shipments would keep coming, and there was this sense that if you didn't keep playing by our rules, by the company's rules, and keep paying for the stuff as it came, which was usually some product that was completely useless, ineffective, or the effect of not playing meant that they would disclose. There was the prospect of your information, your private information, being exposed to somebody else. And that could be very terrifying for some people, right? So in that sense, you have to think about it as, it's a form of blackmail, really. And in this case, the blackmail becomes a kind of marketing tactic, and to get people to purchase something that they really had no intention of doing. And they're doing that because of the shame and ignorance, right? The ignorance is that people may not know much at all about how to deal with impotence or how to deal with sexually transmitted diseases. So there's ignorance in that sense. And then added to that is the shame the social shame of those conditions. It creates more secrecy in that sense. And that this creates a real fertile ground potentially for some types of businesses to prey on people. And ultimately, in this case, as we saw, to blackmail them. The key factor to remember is about the lack of anonymity. Like if you go into a store and you see there's a remedy for impotence and you're willing to, have, I guess there's, and you're willing to pay cash, let's say, the only lack of anonymity is if you happen to know the person working in the store, or you happen to know somebody you see or something like that. But for the most part, when you buy things using cash and going to stores, that's a fairly anonymous kind of transaction, right? It's not anonymous whenever you're writing, right? Name, address, condition. You've got those three things coming together. And that actually is a type of information that goes over to the company, and it becomes a form of power. And we'll see that in a second as well in further discussion of this. All right. Now here's another example of the way that companies would get health information from people. And again, later it becomes a form of power and profit for these companies. So this is a symptom blank. And you would have seen in the late 1800s, early 1900s, lots of companies, patent medicine companies, that would advertise using symptom blanks. So essentially, this is an example of one you can see right here, and it would run, say, in a newspaper ad, and effectively, the thing that this ad promised was that if you were to fill out this information, include your name and address, and then include some of the symptoms that you currently have, some of the health problems that you have, fill them out, mail this back, in this case to the Dr. Branneman Remedy Company, mail it back, and they would provide you with a free diagnosis for what ails you. Okay? And you're thinking, well, what do I got to lose? I've got like these aches and pains. I've got problems hearing. I can't seem to get help from a doctor for this. I can't afford a doctor. What do I have to lose by just filling this out and sending it off, right? And what would happen was these were initially the Dr. Branneman Company would sort of write back and say, well, your diagnosis is this, and the remedy that we provide, or the sort of cure we provide, is in fact a product that we produce. And then, of course, they would try to get the person to buy that through mail order. Okay, so there were lots and lots of these symptom blanks that were done, and they were, as you can see here, lots of detailed information. This one has name, age, gender, marital status, occupation, weight, height. So those are some demographic features. But it was also, there were about 30 questions that are health questions, right? And asking things like what ailments you had, what were the eyes, ears, nose, throat, the whole gamut in that sense, right? So there was a pretense, by providing all this detailed information, the pretense that the company presented was that the more detailed information we get about you, the more accurate our diagnosis can be for you. Of course, all that information has value, right? So the true purpose of this for Dr. Branneman, in the first order, it was to try and then get a follow-up sale. But subsequently, companies like this realized that this information on its own actually had value. So, and here's part of the value that was created, right? Companies, whether through symptom blanks or whether through the letters that people wrote to patent medicine companies, over time, lots of these patent medicine companies had lots of letters and lots of symptom blanks and the rest. And over time, companies might think, well, I don't really need all these letters anymore. I think I've sold what I can from this group of customers. I might as well see what I can get for these letters. And sure enough, there was a market for selling these letters or these symptom blanks potentially to other patent medicine companies that might want to market a bit differently or target different types of people than they've been doing before. And so what you actually had by the early 1900s was the rise of a particular business sector called letter brokers. And they were centered in New York. And essentially these were small companies that were basically just in the business of buying and selling these letters, and then related sorts of things like mailing lists, symptom blanks, and things like that. So they would often, when they were advertising and trying to sell to patent medicine companies, they would often say, well, we can give you letters based on disease. We can, give you, if you just want to have people who you think have cancer or asthma or deafness, well, we can just sell you only letters that talk about deafness, or we can sell you only letters that talk about emphysema or something like that. And so they would actually sell lists. So you could buy, for example, for $5, you could buy or rent. Sometimes you would just rent the letters for a month or two, and then you have to sell them or mail them back. But for $5, you could get 1,000 letters for something like deafness, cancer. You might have to pay $20 for 1,000 of those letters, or something like that, right? So the price could vary depending on how common the disease was and other factors as well. So these letter brokers are in the market, and here's one example of a company. It's called the Guild Company. I'm just going to read you from their advertisement that they would have sent out to patent medicine companies, touting the kind of business they had and what they could gain, what patent medicine companies could gain from buying from these letter brokers. As they said, this is a 1906 ad that they sent out. Many parties using our letters are getting rich quick, quietly working some good legitimate schemes. With attractive, convincing literature, they circularize, or they send out 100,000 or more to people who are directly interested in their line in 2 weeks. The returns are sure and quick. No expensive newspaper advertising, right? So what they're saying there basically is, if you're a patent medicine company and you've got this product and you're saying it's going to be a good treatment for deafness, well, you don't really want to contact a mass of people, right? Because most people aren't deaf. You ideally want to contact only those people that have hearing problems or have full-blown deafness or something, right? So where do you find them, right? They're not just sort of hanging out one particular part of town or something like that. So this is a way to find them, because those people, in some cases, have written letters or filled out symptom blanks documenting their hearing loss. So that's a form of direct marketing. You target the few who are potentially interested in what you have. And because of that, you don't have to do mass advertising or broad-based advertising. You're doing a very pinpointed kind of targeted thing. Okay. So one example that I particularly like about this was an outfit called the Astropathic Institute. Now, it got lists of people, these letters, detailing, John Smith in Omaha, Nebraska, having deafness, let's say. And they got lists of all kinds of ailments. And what they did was they wrote these people and said, we're this outfit that does fortune telling. We can, we do a kind of an astrological reading of sorts of this and that. And we just want to, we're writing you now, and we're just going to give you a kind of a teaser what we think you're about. And they might just sort of mention, what their astrological kind of assumption is for what this person is. And lo and behold, they'll mention the deafness in the letter. Now, the person getting the letter is reading this going, wow, I wonder how they would know that I have a hearing problem. They've actually mentioned that as something that they anticipate about who I am, or the stars have told them that I'm deaf. And you think, wow, that's a really good thing. And so what the Astropathic Institute also offered was that, and they would put this in the letter, they would say, well, if you want a full-blown astrological reading of who you are and your future telling and that sort of thing. Send us $10 and we'll provide that, right? So the teaser, the kind of bait, was the ability to know a particular health problem with different types of people. And when you would write them cold and basically somehow miraculously know that they had asthma or hearing problems or whatever, people were more inclined to think, I could really benefit from this accurate reading of my future from this company, because clearly they've got something right, because they knew I was deaf. And so they'd be willing to pay the $10 for that. Okay, so that's an interesting example of how knowledge or information becomes knowledge on the part of companies like this, and how it can be used for profit down the road. Now, these types of lists, basically where you can get contact information of people, whether by email or even mail order or mail address, they still exist today. There's some attempts to kind of restrict these types of entities, and the U.S. Congress a few years ago really investigated this. But essentially, I just went on the internet and looked for some examples of this. I've got a couple here. One's from U.S. Data Corporation, and the next one is from Nextmark. I'm just going to read you, if you were to go to the website for Netmark, this is what it would say, that they have basically files that contain more than 50 million direct mail and internet questionnaire responders who have indicated that they suffer from various ailments and diseases, or they take specific medications, or they have other health conditions. They say that the information is updated monthly and that email addresses are verified weekly. So essentially, you could contact them and say, I'd like an email list of people with asthma. And they would sell you that and the like. This is the other point here, is the comprehensive database is derived from daily online questionnaire and surveys from more than 36 consumer panel websites. So they're collecting information on these online, whether they're sort of contests or consumer panels or questionnaires or something like that. And so for whatever reason, people might say that they have acne, or even they list things like acne, bad breath, constipation, cancer. These are all the things you can get lists of people who have these afflictions. And they have this information because at some point somebody has shared this information online, and the companies are able to harvest that and then to potentially profit by it. So probably one of the more prominent examples of this today is from the Real Age survey you can do. And Dr. Oz, MedNet Oz, who you probably know as a TV show, and he's an actual doctor, but also a bit of a quack in terms of some of the things he does. He's a promoter or a backer of this, and essentially this is you can go to the website. I don't want you guys to do this because I don't think you should ever disclose this type of information. But essentially, the attraction of this website is you can put in all your health information that they ask, and then after you do that, it will give you a number which is your sort of your health age, your real age, as opposed to your actual age. So let's say you were 40 and you put in that you were, all these healthy things about yourself, and you didn't have these conditions or something like that. It might say at the end, your real age is 35 instead of 40 or something like that. So that's the lure, right? People want to find out if they're healthier than the average person for their age or something. But in fact, what this operation is set up to do is just harvest that data, right? 150 questions. And there's lots of things they ask you for, and it can take upwards to 45 minutes to complete it. So, and what they do then, this company, is then it sells that information to pharmaceutical companies and other types of health organizations or health companies that are looking to target people with particular conditions, right? And I want to just focus on one example. It was also talked about in a New York Times article that looked at real age. And it's an example from Hologic. and it's product called NovaSure. Now, NovaSure is a product that is targeted to women with heavy menstruation. Okay. Now, the one of the questions would ask of women, whether their menstruation was normal or heavy, or how they perceived it, or something like that. And so those that responded that it was heavy would have then been, those people would have received an email from Hologic, because they paid for this, right? They paid for the information. They would have received an email which initially was just providing general information about heavy menstruation, not trying to sell the product initially, but just trying to give information. And they did that in part because they wanted to build that trust, right? Build the trust with those people. And one of the company executives was talking about this approach, and he was talking about the issue of heavy menstruation and the product NovaSure. And he said, a lot of women don't know it's a problem, and that's the thing. It's not something they necessarily talk about. Again, there's the secrecy, right? Maybe even a bit of a social stigma. And so when that secrecy, that stigma is there, it creates this opportunity. So in the case of Hologic, what they would do is they would initially just provide information in these emails to these women who had previously identified themselves as having this condition in the Real Age survey. And then after a while, the emails would start mentioning NovaSure. And this would be sort of encouraging them to tell their doctor this was something they want to have prescribed. Okay. So that's how Real Age worked in this context. Remember, it's really doing what those patent medicine companies were doing more than 100 years ago, right? It's a modern day form of a symptom blank. Now, so what I've been discussing so far, and it's both in the sort of historical patent medicine context, but also in the modern day examples I just presented right there, right? That this is in the patent medicine context especially, it's a form of direct mail marketing, right? You're not trying to mass market. You're trying to get lists of people that have a condition, and you've got a product for that condition, and you're dealing directly with them through mail, okay? Direct mail. It's also a form of early database marketing, right? Because you're getting all this information that's coming in about different types of people with different health conditions, and then you have to then index that information so that you can resell it to people who only want deafness sufferers or only want asthma sufferers or whatever, right? This, in marketing terms, is a kind of, targeted marketing, right? There's no kind of broad shotgun mass advertising approach here, right? It's very targeted to the specific people who are germane to the product that's being offered. And sometimes, because of the correspondence back and forth between Pinkham and others, we might call it today, sometimes it's referred to as one-to-one marketing. Now, those initial patent medicine firms, when Lydia Pinkham started doing that, having people write letters to them, they just initially saw it as a way to cement sales, right? To sort of get people to eventually buy the product. It's only over time that they realized that this information actually has a secondary value, right? And it's this way, it's a kind of twofold commodification. The first form of commodification is just getting people to buy the vegetable compound. But the second form of commodification is realizing that the health information they provide also has value. It can become a commodity. And the commodities we saw were those letter broker companies that were buying and selling the letters themselves. So this is an illustration of what I call a kind of marketing capitalism, that the actions of marketing, right? Reaching out to consumers, getting information about them, trying to sell them stuff, but that information can be valuable to your own company, but it can also be valuable as a secondary form of commodity, right? That you can actually sell that information to others, right? So it's important to remember that and to think about how information, in this sense, fosters new types of social relations and commercial exchanges. So if you were to think about the person going into the store, anonymously paying for cash, and then leaving with the product. That's mostly anonymous. There's no power that's sort of brought over to the other side, to the manufacturer. But once you do that transaction through name and address and medical condition, you create new forms of social relations, and a new kind of commercial exchange happens in that context. And in that sense, it's illustrative of Michel Foucault's ideas about the entwining of power and knowledge and information, and the conflation of those things. One of the points to remember, and it's Foucault's point as well, is that often these relations are asymmetrical. They're uneven kind of power relations that exist, right? And so somebody reading a newspaper in 1900, and let's say the person has problems with impotence, and they see an ad offering a free pamphlet with information about impotence, they might initially think, well, what's the harm, right? I'm not really going to be adversely affected by this. It's free. What do I have to lose? They don't realize the power imbalance, right? Once they write the letter, once their name and address and health condition is provided to the company, then the power balance shifts radically to the other side. So it's an asymmetrical kind of relationship between both sides in that sense. All right, so we'll end there, and we'll chat again on Tuesday. Thank you.